On April the 8th, 2025, an ordinary night of music and celebration in Santo Domingo turned into one of the deadliest structural disasters in the country's history, when the roof of the Jet Set Nightclub collapsed without warning in the middle of a packed live performance. Hundreds of people had gathered inside a venue that, for decades, had been woven into the city's cultural life, a place trusted not only for entertainment, but for the memories it held across generations. In the span of a few unimaginable seconds, that sense of safety gave way to devastation, leaving families shattered, a nation in mourning, and urgent questions about responsibility, oversight, and the quiet warnings that went unheeded. On the night of April the 8th, 2025, Santo Domingo, a coastal capital on the southern edge of the Dominican Republic, was moving through its usual late-night rhythm. The city draws visitors for its colonial history and seaside setting, but its nightlife is shaped primarily by locals, and along Avenida Independencia, a busy corridor of clubs and music venues, people gathered not as tourists, but as regulars. The Jet Set Nightclub was not a destination for holidaymakers. It was a long-standing local institution. Operating for more than 50 years in a building originally constructed as a cinema, Jet Set had become one of the country's most recognizable live music venues, particularly associated with merengue and its reliably packed Monday night performances, drawing generations of residents who trusted the space as part of the fabric of everyday life. That evening was no exception. Inside, hundreds of people filled the dance floor and surrounding seating areas, drawn by a live performance by legendary merengue singer Rubén Perez. The crowd included longtime fans, families, public figures, musicians and staff, many of them regulars who felt safe in a place they had visited countless times before. Estimates later placed attendance somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people, a number consistent with previous events held at the venue. Nothing about the evening suggested danger. The music was loud, the atmosphere joyful, and the building, at least to those inside, appeared stable. But just after midnight, that sense of normalcy vanished. Witnesses would later describe hearing unfamiliar sounds coming from above, cracking, popping, and the faint fall of dust from the ceiling. In a crowded nightclub filled with music and movement, these signs were easy to dismiss. Some believed it was part of the show. Others thought it was a minor issue that would pass. It did not. Without warning, the roof of the building collapsed in a matter of seconds. Concrete slabs, steel supports, lighting equipment and heavy rooftop installations crashed down onto the crowd below. The stage, the dance floor and much of the seating area were instantly buried beneath tons of debris. Power was lost immediately, plunging the interior into darkness. Survivors later recalled confusion, suffocating dust, and the sound of people calling out to loved ones trapped nearby. Many were pinned beneath rubble, unable to move, while others escaped through gaps created by the collapse, injured and in shock. One survivor account later described a mother seated with her son, who noticed fine dust falling from the ceiling into her glass, a detail she immediately recognized as wrong. She stood and warned nightclub staff, but was reportedly reassured and told to return to her table. Moments later, a larger piece of debris fell onto the table itself, a final unmistakable warning arriving just before the roof collapsed. Emergency responders arrived within minutes of the collapse, but what they encountered was a scene of near total destruction that immediately complicated rescue efforts. Firefighters described a building that had not partially failed, but collapsed inward almost entirely, leaving layers of concrete, steel and debris compressed into tight, unstable spaces. Medical teams and civil defence units worked alongside volunteers through choking dust and darkness, listening for voices beneath the rubble and marking areas where sounds or movement were detected. Heavy machinery was brought in cautiously, while search dogs and manual digging were used in zones where even the smallest vibration could prove deadly. One firefighter later recalled, "There were moments when we stopped everything because we thought we heard someone breathing. You don't forget that sound." After nearly 4 days of continuous search and rescue operations, authorities made the announcement families had been dreading. No further survivors were expected. The operation shifted quietly from rescue to recovery. and responders spoke of the emotional weight of continuing work in silence, knowing that every removal of debris now revealed loss rather than life. "We stayed because they were still someone's family," one rescuer said, "and they deserved to be brought home." Long after the site was cleared, responders spoke quietly of the emotional toll, carrying images and sounds from those days that did not fade when the work ended. By the time rescue and recovery efforts concluded, at least 236 people had lost their lives, with more than 180 others injured, many suffering severe and life-altering trauma. Among the dead were Rubén Perez, who was performing when the collapse occurred, and former Major League Baseball players Octavio Dotel and Tony Blanco. Also killed were a regional governor, Nelsie Cruz, and business owners, students, parents and the nightclub employees who had simply gone to work that night. The scale of the loss rippled through the country. Hospitals in Santo Domingo were quickly overwhelmed, and families gathered outside emergency rooms and the disaster site, desperately searching for information. For days, the city lived in a state of collective grief and uncertainty. Survivors of the Jet Set Nightclub collapse sustained a wide range of severe injuries, reflecting the sudden, crushing nature of the roof failure and the density of the crowd beneath it. Medical teams described injuries typical of large-scale structural collapses, many of them life-threatening. People trapped beneath the debris suffered crush injuries, including shattered limbs, crushed chests, and severe internal bleeding caused by the weight of concrete and steel. Head and spinal injuries were common, as falling slabs struck people from above, leaving some survivors with permanent neurological damage or paralysis. Others sustained multiple fractures to arms, legs, ribs and pelvises, often combined with deep lacerations from twisted metal and broken fixtures. Many victims also experienced asphyxiation injuries, either from being pinned in confined spaces or from inhaling dust and debris that filled the air after the collapse. Survivors later reported struggling to breathe in near total darkness as fine concrete dust clogged their lungs. In the days that followed, hospitals treated patients for compartment syndrome, organ damage and long-term trauma, both physical and psychological. Doctors noted that even those who escaped with relatively minor injuries would carry lasting effects as post-traumatic stress, survivor's guilt and chronic pain became part of life after the disaster. One survivor later said, "You go out expecting music and laughter, and suddenly you're digging with your hands, hoping the person next to you is still breathing." As investigations began, attention quickly turned to the structure itself and to how a building never designed for modern nightclub use had been allowed to carry decades of additional weight. The Jet Set Nightclub had originally been constructed in the early 1970s as a movie theatre, a type of building intended to support relatively light roof loads and seated audiences below. When it was later converted into a nightclub, the interior was opened up to create a large, column-free space for standing crowds, lighting rigs and amplified sound, a change that dramatically increased both the live load inside the building and the structural demands placed on the roof above. Over the years, investigators found that the roof had been repeatedly modified and reinforced using additional layers of concrete, a practice sometimes used to address leaks or surface deterioration, but one that significantly increases dead weight. Each new layer added tons of mass to a structure that had not been engineered to carry it. On top of this, large industrial air conditioning units, ventilation systems and water tanks were installed directly on the roof, concentrating weight in specific areas rather than distributing it evenly. Structural engineers later estimated that the roof was bearing several hundred tons more than its original design capacity, with some estimates placing the combined rooftop load at well over 400 tons. Critically, experts determined that the building lacked sufficient internal support columns or load-bearing reinforcements to safely manage this weight over time. Instead, the roof relied on aging beams and slabs that were slowly subjected to stress, moisture infiltration and material fatigue. No evidence was found of a comprehensive structural assessment or engineering review following renovations or equipment additions, meaning that warning signs, including cracks, leaks and sagging, were never formally evaluated. Investigators concluded that the collapse was not the result of a single failure, but of a gradual overload that reached a breaking point, turning years of accumulated decisions into a sudden and catastrophic outcome. Investigators also examined the building's history, and they noted that the structure had already endured significant stress before the night of the collapse. In 2023, the building that housed the Jet Set Nightclub experienced a fire after its generator room was struck by lightning. Firefighters responded and later deemed the structure safe for continued use, and no injuries were reported at the time. Investigators were also careful to address the role of vibration inside the nightclub. Music and dancing do not cause collapse in a properly designed structure, and authorities emphasised that the disaster was not the result of sound or movement alone. However, in an ageing building already weakened by overload, past damage and material fatigue, vibration can act as a trigger rather than a cause. Loud music produces low-frequency vibrations, and hundreds of people moving in unison place rhythmic stress on beams and slabs, gradually worsening existing cracks and fatigue. Structural engineers describe this as a last straw effect. The building had been failing slowly for years, and the conditions of a crowded nightclub may have influenced the timing of the collapse, turning a long-developing failure into a sudden and catastrophic one. The disaster was completely avoidable. It was the result of systemic neglect. As these findings became public, anger spread well beyond the immediate families of the victims and into the wider Dominican society. Vigils turned into protests, and questions that had first been whispered at hospital doors were now being asked openly. How could a venue operating for decades, hosting hundreds of people every week, have gone so long without meaningful oversight? Within weeks, the nightclub's owners, Antonio Espaillat and Maribel Espaillat, were arrested and formally charged with involuntary homicide, accused of failing to ensure the structural safety of the building, despite repeated warning signs. And while the charges represented a rare step towards accountability in cases involving private entertainment venues, many families of the victims felt the legal response fell short of reflecting the scale and duration of the negligence involved. Relatives spoke of decades of uninspected modifications, ignored maintenance issues, and decisions that placed convenience and profit ahead of safety. As of the time of reporting, the court proceedings had not yet reached a final verdict, leaving families in a prolonged state of uncertainty. One grieving family member told reporters, "This wasn't an accident, this was something waiting to happen, and no one stopped it." A sentiment echoed by many who argued that the collapse was not a sudden tragedy. In the months following the collapse, authorities in the Dominican Republic announced new measures aimed at preventing similar tragedies in older public venues. These included mandatory structural inspections for entertainment buildings constructed before modern safety codes, stricter oversight of building conversions and rooftop installations, and broader criminal liability for owners who ignore known safety risks. Yet engineers, advocacy groups, and victims' families warned that laws alone would not be enough. Building regulations had existed for years but were often weakly enforced, and without transparent inspections and independent oversight, many feared the conditions that led to the Jet Set disaster could persist long after the headlines faded. Today, the site of the former Jet Set Nightclub remains sealed and untouched, held in place by ongoing investigations and legal proceedings. No new structure has replaced it. And what was once a venue defined by music and celebration has become an informal memorial, its perimeter lined with candles, flowers, photographs and handwritten messages left by families, friends and strangers alike. For many in Santo Domingo, the location no longer represents nightlife or celebration, but quiet remembrance. Authorities have stated that any future decision regarding the demolition or redevelopment will depend on the outcome of court cases, structural reviews and consultation with victims' families, leaving the site as it is for now, a visible marker of loss and questions that have yet to be fully answered. The people inside Jet Set that night were not taking a risk. They were doing something ordinary, meeting friends, listening to music, spending a few hours in a place that had been part of their lives for years. Some had been there dozens of times before. They trusted the building because it had always been there. When the roof collapsed, it took away more than a night of celebration. It took parents from children, children from parents, and futures that will never unfold. What remains is not just grief, but absence, and the knowledge that those lives were lost in a place that should have been safe. They had every reason to believe that they would return home safely, but they didn't get the chance. Quite obviously, this is an immense tragedy, and our condolences go out to the families of those people who lost their lives, but also to the families of people who suffered life-changing injuries. Despite the content, I hope you like the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I wish you bye-bye for now.